When I am out and about in Las Cruces, it's not unusual for people to ask me what I do and where I work. It's basic small talk, right? So when the topic of Morning Star comes up, it's not uncommon for me to hear, "Oh, I know that church." Perhaps they've heard about the food pantry or the free weddings or our partnership with Camino Middle School. But more than anything, the response I hear is, "If I went to church, I would go to yours." If I went to church. But they don't. And some swear that they won't. Now, these are good people. They're open to God. They don't have any problems with Jesus. They're trying to live in a way that makes a difference in this world, but they have no use for the church. And they're not alone. Growing numbers of people are arriving at the same conclusion, especially the younger generations, some of whom have never set foot in a church building ever in their lifetime. So what is the point of church? Why do we exist? I'm glad you asked. These questions will prove to be central to our 5-week worship series, which we're calling Muscle Memory, recalling why the church even matters today. And this theme has been inspired by traits identified by innovative leaders at the Texas Methodist Foundation as being essential to healthy and growing churches. They call these traits the 5 adaptive muscles. So we start today with tending grief. And you may be tired of tending grief at this point because we spent several weeks on this topic just before Easter. But that series focused on personal grief. Today we're going to talk about collective grief. Today we're going to talk about what it means to love and to lose as the church with a capital C. And Jesus knew something about that. While he's out in the countryside teaching and healing, his dear friend Lazarus falls gravely ill and dies. When Jesus finally makes it back to Bethany to see the family, Lazarus' sisters, Martha and Mary, basically tell him, "If you had been here, our brother would not have died." And that's where we pick up in verse 33. John 11, 33 through 36. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" See how he loved him. So much has been written about this passage by people who claim that Jesus wept because he was disappointed in his friends, because he judged their grief as a lack of faith, because they should have trusted that Jesus would resurrect Lazarus. We've talked about this before. Do you remember? Why did Jesus weep? Why did he weep? Because he was sad. Because he had loved Lazarus, and now Lazarus was dead. And yes, we know that Jesus had the power to raise Lazarus from the dead, and that he would do so moments later as the story continues. But at this moment, Jesus has the courage to sit with what he feels about what had been lost, and about how others felt about it too. He was brave enough in community to love and to lose. And that's a good basic definition of grief, proof that we have loved and lost. Our grappling, somebody is grieving right now, poor thing. Our grappling with the reality that something we never wanted to happen has happened, that things have changed. And again, this experience applies not just to individuals, but to groups, even to churches. Because some things have changed, haven't they? So what has changed? In the church at large, at Morning Star, in your lifetime, what has changed? I'm really asking you, what has changed? Yes, Henry. New people come here every day, and that's a good change. Yes, thank you. What else? What has changed? Stephanie? Yes, God changes us. Absolutely. What has changed? Laura? You can wear shorts. So our dress has become casual. Yes, people have died, right? People have moved. People have left quietly. People have left angry. We've aged. Service times have changed. The children are incorporated in worship now. Finances have fluctuated. We painted the walls. Some programs have dissolved. Others are just beginning. And that's just in the 5 years since I've been here. And of course, in the Church Universal, we've been watching our relevance shrink as more and more people turn elsewhere for hope and belonging, if they dare to turn anywhere at all. But the good news of Jesus is still the good news, but times have changed. And on our better days, we do our best to just get on with life, but all too often we don't pause long enough to actually deal with the loss, to name it and process it and really feel it. We just slap Ecclesiastes 3 on it and try to keep going. I'm sure many of you could quote it. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die. For everything, there is a season and a time. Well, sure, there's a time. And that time is limited, but that doesn't mean we need to sweep our losses under the rug. It doesn't mean we need to sweep our losses under the rug. It doesn't mean that we ignore grave illness. It doesn't mean that we deny the power of death. We are people of resurrection. But for resurrection to happen, death must happen first. We must acknowledge it and weep as Jesus did. We must possess the skills, the muscle memory to tend to our grief with honesty and with compassion. And sometimes that is easier said than done. Sometimes it requires us to dissect our feelings of anger and resentment to get to the core of what we're really feeling. Sadness or loss or fear of irrelevance. And once we've demonstrated the courage to acknowledge our feelings, we can create space to name what has been lost and to give thanks for what it's given us, for what we've learned from it. And when we learn to bless what no longer serves us and release it from our emotional grip, then we're free to participate in what comes next. You can imagine how frustrated Martha and Mary must have been with Jesus for arriving so late. But I wonder how they felt when Jesus chose to join them in their grief rather than to dismiss it, to sit with them in the heavy sorrow of community, contemplating just exactly what they had lost with the death of Lazarus. Beloved, when we grieve, we honor the value of what has been lost. It's only there in that raw acknowledgement of death and what death has taken from us that new life, life after death, becomes a possibility. And this is as true for us as an institutional church as it was for those who loved Lazarus. Heaven help us, we are spending so much time trying to stitch things back together to the way they were, to keep the church as it remains in our collective memory from dying. Surely we tell ourselves if we just bring back the name tags and the bake sales and the pledge drives, surely people will come back or start coming in the first place. But it won't work. Those days have passed. But still we pine for those days and we criticize the school system for holding meetings on Wednesdays. We criticize sports teams for holding games on Sundays. And we criticize technology for ruining our social skills. But our complaining will not change a thing, because things have already changed. The whole world has changed around the church and has been for decades, but we haven't. And somehow we pride ourselves for that, for holding fast to the way things were. But what are we holding on to? The way we do things was never the point. The method is just a means for delivering the message. Beloved, somewhere along the way, we have made the grave mistake of confusing the church with the gospel. We have made a grave mistake in confusing the way we do church with the gospel message. And that's what hasn't changed, the gospel message. God's message of grace through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. God's Spirit alive and well and moving in our day. Our message of hope in a world of hopelessness. But no one will hear it if we're not willing to go where they are and to speak their language when we get there. But before we can learn to do that, we must be willing to bless and release what is no longer serving us. Because we are not called to be the church of yesterday. We are called to be the church of today and of tomorrow. And if we're going to become that church, we need new muscle memory. So I invite you to hold up your hand. We're going to use our hands to represent the 5 adaptive muscles in this series. 5 fingers for 5 muscles. If you don't have 5 fingers on either hand, it's okay. Just work with what you got. So the first muscle is tending grief, and that is represented by our thumb, which is so important to the rest of our hand for our other tasks. So whenever you look at your thumb, you can remember this important practice of tending to your grief, personally, but also collectively as a church. And that doesn't mean we're going to change anything for change's sake, okay? You don't need to panic. There are a lot of things going on at Morning Star that are good and that are helpful. It just means that we have to be willing to admit that what worked yesterday may not work today. And what works today may not work tomorrow. Or as Dr. Levi Batista said in a recent webinar, nostalgia cannot be our governing ethic. Nostalgia cannot be our governing ethic, because when that happens, our adaptive muscles begin to atrophy, and we lose sight of our purpose. So to keep ourselves fit and agile and ready for God's now, we must be willing to ask ourselves, what do we need to bless and release? What do we need to bless and release? And that starts with being honest about what we are really feeling. And this is a big deal, because if we are the kind of people who are willing to weep with Jesus outside of the tomb, we just might be able, by God's grace, to become the community for the people who say, if I went to church, I would go to yours, whether they ever set foot in this building or not. Because it's only when we're willing to love and to lose that we can become the church of today, a church that matters. Amen? Amen.